What's the story, everyone? Welcome back to Gaelic Games Fan TV. How's the form? How is everybody getting on? So Dessie Farrell stays on as Dublin Senior Football Manager. It has been confirmed. It was obviously confirmed a couple of days ago. He'll be staying on until the end of the 2025 season with the Dublin footballers, at a minimum, basically. Just here to react to the news, discuss it, and obviously, what does it mean for Dublin going into next season? Can Dublin win back-to-back All-Ireland titles? Obviously something we haven't achieved since obviously the 6-in-a-row spell, so it'll be interesting to know, like, can Dublin go and win back-to-back All-Irelands, and what is the expectations and thinking for Dublin going into next year? If you're new to the channel, hit the like button and subscribe. It would be very much appreciated. And just as an FYI, if you do see my eye be quite red and, I don't know, gush up at different points, I do have a slight eye infection, unfortunately, at the minute, which is why I look a bit like James Bond villain, which some people have told me it's actually not a bad thing. Makes me look a bit more tough and intimidating. Probably it's not true though, is it? It's not true. But there we go. Anyway, we're getting away from the topic. Back to Dessie. Back to big Dessie Farrell. Yeah, look, to be fair, once Dublin won the All-Ireland last year, I quickly, put my hands up and said, look, I was wrong. I was wrong about Dessie. I was wrong about Dublin. I was wrong about last season in terms of, there was moments last year, and I think if you go back and look at match reactions from Dublin games, Dublin versus Roscommon or Dublin versus Kildare, I would have said openly, and, Dublin were going backwards, and it felt like Dublin football was going backwards. It felt like we weren't improving. It felt like, Dublin were going from... Obviously, we'd won the 6-in-a-row, and look, it was a generational team that won that 6-in-a-row, and those type of teams, it's the only time it's ever happened. And I know a lot of people look at Dublin's dominance due to resources and funding, and people point out different things and point out this and point out that. Those group of players and that team that won the 6-in-a-row was just a generational football team, a bit like the Limerick Hurlers right now. And I know a lot of people can point to resources and funding, and look, those things do matter. Those things do play a part, don't get me wrong. It's the reason why we've seen so much improvement from players in Dublin. It's the reason why we've so much of a pick in terms of clubs in the county. The population does play a difference for Dublin, but it isn't the sole factor. It isn't the sole factor, and I've mentioned that on numerous occasions before. But the point I'm getting at is that, Dublin won that 6-in-a-row. But for me, a lot of the Dublin players who were part of that 6-in-a-row team were in this team this season. And yes, you can make the point that James McCarthy, Dean Rock, obviously Cluxton came back. A lot of those players, Mick Fitzsimons, are on the better part of their 30s. There is a regression there. The talent levels probably aren't going to be the same. But the likes of Fenton, Kilkenny, Con O'Callaghan, Jack McCaffrey, for me, I all felt, look, these players are still in their prime. And we've got a golden generation of players right here, and for Dublin in particular, they need to capitalise on it. And that was my thinking throughout the year, was that Dessie is not getting the best out of the players he had available to him. And when you looked at the majority of the performances, I think I was validated in many ways, or I was validated at the time, and I think a lot of fellow Dublin fans very much agreed with me at that moment in time. Now in hindsight, as I said, I got it wrong. I think in the end, Dessie Farrell and the Dublin management team, the physios, the strength and conditioning coaches got absolutely everything spot on, because it was clear as day when you look back now, Dublin were saving themselves for the All-Ireland series, and they were saving themselves for the quarterfinals, the semi-finals and the final. Dublin were preparing themselves to peak at exactly the right time, and in a lot of ways it makes sense. Look, when you've got players like James McCarthy, Cluxton, even Paul Mannion, Jack McCaffrey, Dublin have a lot of players within that panel who've played a lot of football in the last 10 years. They've a lot of players who have a lot of mileage on the clock, players who have been around, playing, in the latter parts of club championships, a lot of intense games over the last 10 seasons or so. And when there is so much mileage on the clock, you need to save your body for when it really matters, because, in hindsight, if Dublin had gone full throttle in the league and played with the same intensity they played with, for example, against Mayo in the quarterfinals, and use that same intensity in the early part of the All-Ireland series and also in the league, I think Dublin would have burnt themselves out. And I think there was evidence of that with Mayo, for example, who went full throttle throughout the league and the early parts of the championship, and then, hit a brick wall once they, got into the All-Ireland series. And I think something similar would have happened with Dublin had that have been the case. So there we go. Look, and fair play to Dessie, fair play to the Dublin management team. They got it spot on. They really, really did. Look, there were some improvements that were needed throughout the season, and I think there was some adjustments. Putting McCarthy into midfield, I think, was a big one that Dublin sort of done from the quarter-final onwards. Getting Colin Basquel more regularly into the team was huge. And also Dean Rock, who was starting quite regularly in the early part of the year, towards the latter part of the year, he was on the bench, and I think that was the right decision as well, because I don't think he quite has the pace for inter-county football anymore, in my opinion. Great impact player, don't get me wrong. Great player to bring off the bench, but I don't think he's a regular starter anymore. But there we go. Look, those were my opinions, and fair play. Look, Desi got it right. I think for that generation of Dublin players and for this generation of Dublin players, I think they deserved that extra All-Ireland. They deserved to become record breakers. And Desi's the man to take them to that summit. It's going to be interesting to see what happens next year and the year after, though, because I think there was a general consensus that last year was the last dance in some ways. We haven't heard any news in terms of any retirements just yet, but as we very well know, Dublin, it's very hard to find information out about Dublin. You know what I mean? Very, very hard to find out what's going on there at times, and we probably won't know about retirements or other news until, the team is back training and everything else. Then we'll know for certain who's actually back in the Dublin team and who isn't. But it will be interesting. Look, Paul Mannion and Jack McCaffrey had opted out for a couple of seasons. They came back last year with the presumption to win the All-Ireland, to get Dublin back to the top. Do they want to go again? Or will they now say, look, we came back for Dublin to win the All-Ireland, we did it, now we're going back to play with our club. And as we know, throughout the season, even for Dublin at the inter-county level, there is injury issues there. There is a lot of injury problems there, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with him. And obviously McCarthy, Cluxton, Dean Rock, what's going to happen with those players? Mick Fitzsimons, are they going to stick around? Because the thing is about Dublin is that, and this might sound a little bit negative in some ways, and maybe at times this year I was quite negative, and I hold my hands up. And sometimes, when you're speaking about your own county, you can be a bit more emotional, you can be a bit more reactionary because of the fact that you are a fan, and I am a fan at the end of the day, and especially when you're making match reactions, you are going to sort of, be a bit more emotional and a bit more sort of reactive in that kind of sense. But I think for Dublin, like, realistically, I look at Dublin football and I think the next year or 2 years, I'd say for Dublin fans, enjoy it. Soak it in, enjoy every moment. We're going to be thereabouts in the All-Ireland over the next 2 seasons. But after that, there is a slight bit of concern because there isn't a huge amount coming through at underage level right now, as of now. Look, that could change in the next couple of years. Maybe the under-20 team kicks on next season. The Miners, for example, had a decent enough season this year. Obviously came through Leinster, got to an All-Ireland semi-final. There does seem to be a couple of players that we could look at there. But I do think generally Dublin, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount coming through at the moment. And look, with the size of the capital, with the amount of club players that we've got, there will always be players available. I mean, you only have to look at the Kilmacud Crokes team and you'll see the amount of players within that team who aren't even in the Dublin panel. And that's the perfect example. There's plenty of great club players. I think players this season from the likes of Raheny, St Jude's and other clubs up and down the country have really put their hands up to come into the team next season should there be retirements. But I think the level of players sort of coming through is not the same as it was during the 6 in a row spell. Like, I think a lot of people forget the reason why the 6 in a row spell happened was because it wasn't just one team that dominated. It was 2 teams. It was 2 Dublin teams essentially. One team just took straight over from the other. I mean, you had Alan Brogan, who retired in 2015. Bernard Brogan slowly started coming to the end of his time from about 2017 onwards. You had Con O'Callaghan slotted in straight away. Kieran Kilkenny slotted in straight away. I know he was around back in 2013, but he was now in his prime. Paul Mannion was now in his prime when he was fit and available. Cormac Costello slowly coming into his prime. And there was players who were there who were able to take the mantle, from the likes of, your Kevin McManamans and your Dean Rocks and everything, who may have been slowly, starting to regress ever so slightly. And even the likes of Noel Scully, Brian Fenton, these players who all started to come through in and around that time period. And that probably is the concern right now from a Dublin perspective, is that there isn't a huge amount coming through. And I think there is a massive rebuild coming for Dublin. Maybe not next year, but I think 2025 or 26, I think there's going to be a huge overhaul of the team, because when you look at it in the last couple of years, probably only one player has really made the breakthrough from underage level into the Dublin senior team, and that's Lee Gannon. Dublin's team in the 2023 All-Ireland final was very similar to the team that played in the 2019 All-Ireland final, and even, the 2018 and 2017 finals. A couple of changes here and there for sure, but generally more or less the same team. And that's why I do think there will be a massive rebuild in the next couple of seasons. But Look, as Dublin fans, I think we have to accept that if you look down through the history of Dublin football, the 6-in-a-row spell, it was a very unique period. Winning the All-Ireland in 2011 and 2013. Dublin didn't win an All-Ireland in the decade previous, won All-Ireland in the 90s, won All-Ireland in the 80s. I know things are a bit different now. Obviously, resources, funding have, incrementally increased since that moment in time. So, Dublin have a lot more available to them now than they did probably back in the 80s and 90s. But, I think there could be, I think Dublin will be thereabouts at times over the next few seasons. But to think that Dublin will dominate in the way that they did in the last decade, in this current decade, I don't think will happen, personally. But one thing you would have to say for Dublin, and obviously the title of the video, can Dublin win back-to-back All-Irelands next season and next year? Obviously, it's very, very early to tell. We'll need to see what player retirements there are, what players could come in from club championships. Obviously, there'll be season previews later in the year, so we'll discuss that obviously then in more detail when we know for certain who's coming into the team and different bits and bobs. But look, Dublin will be there. They will be thereabouts. And I think Dublin's approach next season will be very similar, if not the same, to this year. I think the league, the most important thing for Dublin will be to stay up. Get 2-3 wins. I don't think Dublin will play particularly brilliant at times in the league. I don't think you'll see Dublin play their fluent style football throughout the league. I think there will be some performances from Dublin in the league next season that leave you scratching your head. But again, I think everyone's approach and thinking of the league next year is going to be different because of the fact that the way the championship is now structured. I think, look, going into Leinster, Dublin don't need to be at their best. I think that goes without saying. Kildare are making improvements, but Dublin don't need to have hit their peak. The most important thing, quarterfinals, semi-finals, the main important thing for Dublin will be hit your peak in that time period. That will be the biggest focus. That will be the biggest thing for Dublin. And having shown that they've done it last year, I do think they can do it again next year. And look, Dublin will be thereabouts. The team who beats Dublin in the championship might be the team who goes on to win the All-Ireland. I think Kerry and Derry will be the two teams I would look at and think, if Dublin were playing either one of them two, I would think this is going to be tough. Outside of that, I'm not really too worried about anyone else. I know Mayo have a very good panel, very good team, but I think they have a lot of things they need to work on. A lot of improvements need to be made within Mayo right now for them to really be strong contenders next year. Look, Galway are coming, but still a young team. Still a lot of improvements are needed from them. I think Tyrone are going to be miles off it next year. I'll be perfectly honest. That could famous last words, which have happened quite usually on this channel. Look, Armagh might be in the conversation, but generally speaking, I think Derry and Kerry are the two teams. As a Dublin fan, I would be most worried about next season. And I think Kerry, like when we talk about Dublin's team and players maybe retiring and players regressing, when you look at this Kerry side, there isn't too much of that. Maybe Paul Gainey, maybe Paul Murphy over the next couple of years, but even he wasn't a regular starter this year. There's enough players within Kerry to keep them ticking for a good couple of years, and that's why I do think Kerry will dominate this decade in terms of All-Ireland wins. I know Dublin have 2 already in this decade, but I do think Kerry will end up with the same, if not more, than Dublin come 2030, which is miles away. But generally, that's what I'm saying. But yeah, let me know your thoughts, your opinions on Dessie Farrell staying on. Look, I think it is the right decision. I think after winning the All-Ireland, I think it was right for Dublin to keep him on. Realistically, there's no one else out there. When you think about it, obviously Declan Darcy's tied up with Leinster's rugby team. Jim Gavin probably isn't going to come back. And look, Dessie won the All-Ireland. And, last year's All-Ireland was a tough one to win. It was a tough one to win because don't get me wrong, Jim Gavin, I think, will go down as one of the greatest Dublin football managers of all time. But, Jim Gavin's Dublin didn't have to deal with this Kerry team. They had to deal with a very, very good Mayo team, in fairness. But they didn't have to deal with the adversity and the setbacks and the hits as this Dublin team have had at times. And Jim Gavin had a Dublin team in their absolute prime, whereas Dessie Farrell has had a Dublin team slightly over the hill, you would say, in some ways. Don't get that twisted. I'm not saying Dessie is a better manager than Jim Gavin. I'm just saying that Dessie Farrell deserves a lot more respect than probably he got, and that's coming from me too, because I was one of his biggest critics this year. But yeah, let me know your thoughts and opinions. Does Dessie stay on beyond 2025 as well? Personally, I don't think he will. I think that will be it. I think he'll do the next 2 years because there's a massive rebuild coming, and does he want to, because the man who comes in for the massive rebuild is going to be the man who's going to really have a job in his hands. Does Desi want to be that man? I'm not sure. But look, let me know your thoughts, your opinions. Hit the like button and subscribe. My name's Aaron. Speak to y'all soon.